Welcome to the Diverse Bookshelf. I'm Samia Aziz, celebrating the power of literature and the voices of authors and changemakers from the global majority. Join me as we explore the stories that inspire, connect, and transform our world. Let's uncover the stories that truly matter together. Today, I have the immense honour of speaking with Elif Shafak, an internationally acclaimed and award winning author whose work has been translated into more than 55 languages. With 21 published books to her name, including 13 novels, Elif has built a remarkable body of work that spans continents, cultures, and generations. Her writing is rich, lyrical, and deeply political, shaped by her experiences of living in multiple countries, her life in exile, and her unwavering belief in the power of stories to build bridges and foster understanding. In this episode, we talk about her latest novel, There Are Rivers in the Sky, a beautifully layered and timely book that flows across generations and continents, weaving together stories of identity, migration, belonging, and the sacredness of water. We explore the urgent themes at the heart of the novel: climate change, political unrest, and the silencing of voices, and how Elif draws on oral storytelling traditions to give voice to those often unheard. We also speak about the symbolism of water, the language of silence, and how fiction can hold both beauty and protest at once. This is a powerful and reflective conversation that touches on hope, resilience, and the role of the writer in turbulent times. I'm beyond honored to be speaking with Elif for this episode. Hello, Elif. Welcome to the Diverse Bookshelf. It's so wonderful to have you on the show. How are you doing?
Well, it's so wonderful to see you. Thank you so much for inviting me. Yeah, I'm well, but we were just talking about that. The world is crazy, so I think we need literature. We need to hear each other's voices even more in these.
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely. And I just want to take a moment because I know, especially in Turkey at the moment, the situation is very, very difficult with the
yeah,
protests taking place following the arrest of the mayor. But unfortunately, the way in which people have been arrested, and I know that this is amid a much longer and a much bigger issue around the decline of democracy in Turkey and the attack on civil liberties. So I just want to sit with you for a moment because I know that you have very strong ties to Turkey, a very complex relationship, but obviously one based on love also. So I can imagine that it's even more difficult for you personally.
and I think it's much more difficult for people who are there. So, but at the same time, as you pointed out, when you're outside or when you're away, it's not like you're disconnected. Your heart is
Mhm.
there. You feel emotionally very connected to the people, the youth, the women, the minorities. So there's so many people in Turkey whose voices maybe are not being heard outside. They're not necessarily covered in newspapers or the news outlets, but they're there, and that's why we need art, we need literature to honor every single human being, to talk about equality, dignity, inclusion, respect for pluralism, respect for democracy. All of these values, they're core values, they're universal values. They do not belong in any particular culture or region. I think they belong to all humanity.
Yeah, absolutely. And you have written and spoken extensively about how literature can be a very, very powerful tool in connecting us to the wider world, in educating and informing us, in fostering empathy. And I've been thinking about this a lot, especially with the way that the world is at the moment, with everything that we've seen unfold in Gaza, but in also Sudan and Yemen and Afghanistan. Just so many places around the world at the moment are experiencing extreme levels of crisis. I don't know what other word to use to describe what's happening. And yet it still feels like so much of the noise and so much of the narrative is still harmful, it's still divisive. There are still so many people choosing to be silent, but there is so much material out there at the moment. There is so much literature.
Yeah.
How do you think we can really make sure that literature and art and maybe information more generally
Mm.
is can be a very actually useful tool in contributing or engaging in the world?
I so appreciate this question and that we're talking about this. And as you pointed out so eloquently, it's so important that are we don't become numb, we
Mm,
don't become indifferent or desensitized, because I think that would be a much darker, more dangerous world to live in. In many ways, the world we're living in is the age of anxiety, the age of angst. But if it were to become the age of apathy, I think it would be much worse. There's so much happening right now, incredible suffering and tragedies taking place in Gaza, in Afghanistan, in Ukraine, in Sudan, in Yemen, and how do we hear these stories? I'm not saying this is the only way, but it's so important that we read more authors coming from these regions. Let's read more Palestinian novelists and poets. Let's also read more Ukrainian poets and journalists. Their voices are so important. Let's hear voices from Afghanistan, not only of women, but also the minorities of Afghanistan. Sudan is so forgotten, and we have no right to forget it. So all these pieces, we need to bring them together because we're all connected. It's not like it's happening somewhere else. There's
yes.
no such a thing as near and far in a world that is so deeply, deeply interconnected. And I think we need literature to remind us of how connected we are, both with each other as human beings across borders, but also with nature. We
Mm,
equally become very arrogant. We think we're the center of the world, whereas we're only a small part of a very delicate ecosystem. And democracy itself is also a very delicate ecosystem. So I think we have a lot of rethinking to do. And in my opinion, the art of storytelling can contribute to these important conversations.
yeah, absolutely. I wholeheartedly agree with you. And I would really like to see more people engaging in literature and not just reading as a passive act. I think part of really taking from literature involves allowing your stereotypes and your ideas to be challenged and allowing yourself to really connect with what it is that you're reading. And Elif, you are a masterful storyteller, a beautiful writer, and you have over the years written an incredible number of books where you are often, as a fiction writer, bringing stories to the fore that often we don't know about things that are happening. These are stories of voices that are often unheard or silenced. And you do also write a lot about intergenerational stories. So a lot of your stories span maybe a particular family that look at different generations, or as with your latest novel, There Are Rivers in the Sky, seemingly disconnected people over a century or centuries. Um, but also what seems to be emerging in your work now is not just a focus on people, but a focus on the planet. So before There Are Rivers in the Sky, your book before was The Island of Missing Trees, which involved a tree, a fig tree that was a narrator, was a character that was talking, unreliable or not, but it was a really phenomenal look at the earth, and the impact of deforestation, but also migration and war. But in There Are Rivers in the Sky, your focus is on water, and you spoke about how, we are all interconnected. And I think water is that biggest reminder that we are also interconnected. And I think there's so much to be focused on and to be learned about with regards to the politics and the urgency of the water crisis. And I wondered if you could speak on that, about what really inspired you to focus on water in this novel.
Yeah, really, really appreciate this question. Before I start writing a novel, I do not say to myself, okay, these are the themes that I want to deal
Mm,
with in this book. It really doesn't work like that at all. I always start with something seemingly small, but somehow that small element can bring me into unknown territories. If that happens, I allow it to happen. In other words, I want to follow the flow of the art of storytelling. I think there are two different ways of writing a novel. One is a bit more cerebral, a bit more like engineering, more mathematical, in which the author wants to know what is going to happen in the next 10 or 15 chapters and how each character is going to behave. I respect that path, but it's not my path. I like the second path in which you write with intuition. You're not that in charge of everything, but you have a very, very strong instinct. However, for me to be able to fly like that, I have to do a lot of research, a lot of maybe my homework I need to do well beforehand. And then there comes a moment you don't necessarily follow a linear path. You just let the story guide you, let the characters surprise you. That's how I approach. I love the novel, the long form, but I also think, to be honest, there are glass walls separating us into boxes. If you happen to be a woman writer from a particular corner of the world, let it be, for instance, Turkey or Afghanistan, you're not expected to write sci fi or experimental fiction or novels of ideas. You're expected to write stories about women in Turkey or women in Afghanistan, which, please don't get me wrong, is so, so important. My point is maybe a novelist might want to do that in one book, but maybe the next book is going to be something about completely different.
Mm.
So that kind of flexibility is usually not given to us when we are just put in a niche, in a box, and expected to stay in that corner once and for all. So I think there are lots of glass walls we need to dismantle in the world of publishing as well. With regards to the recent novel, There Are Rivers in the Sky, as you pointed out, at the first glance, it might seem like this is an epic book in the sense that it does span countries and centuries and continents across a big chunk of time. But actually, everything came to me with something very, very small and seemingly insignificant. And that was just a drop of water. It was just a raindrop that landed on my hand. And I was thinking, I was looking at it and thinking, can I see the universe in this raindrop? It's almost a mystical, spiritual question, one that William Blake asked when he was looking at a grain of sand. He wanted to see the universe in that grain of sand. So that little question brought me to the story of water. Water brought me to the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is the oldest piece of literature known in human history. That brought me to a remarkable Victorian character called George Smith. I based my one of my characters loosely on him, and that brought me to the British Museum and important issues like cultural artifacts and who gets to tell the story of the past. So all I'm trying to say is, yes, this is the story of three characters who seem to be very different, but they are connected, and then two rivers, again, that seem to be in completely different places, the Thames and the Tigris in the Middle East, and then one ancient poem, 321, and that poem is the Epic of Gilgamesh, and they're all connected via that little single drop of water.
And I think water is so, like, metaphorically and symbolically, it's so powerful. You know, you described your writing process as something that flows much like water flows, and water takes the shape of the container or the geography of where it is. And sometimes it's like incredibly fierce, and other times it's incredibly calm. And I think that really, like, it reflects how we are as people. But I think you've spoken about the importance of storytelling, and especially when it comes to the experiences of women. And just as you were talking, but also while reading your book, I was thinking about how we often ignore the importance of water in the world around us. Like, we know that our body is like 70% water, and we know that the earth is 70% water, but there's huge consequences for how water is treated, for how water is managed and controlled. It feels bizarre to me that there are actual men who control the flow of water in the world that leads to flash flooding in incredibly vulnerable communities already as it is. But also, there are so many places around the world that are water deprived, and it is the responsibility of women in a lot of these societies. In fact, I would say all of them really, the responsibility of women and also children to collect water. And this involves, as you know, like walking for hours and hours every day in the blazing heat, uh, carrying water often on their heads or on their bodies. Um, and often that water is not even safe to drink. And then if we delve even further and we think about how the lack of water can impact women, especially, and obviously a lack of water will impact anybody, but the actual life-threatening illnesses that develop when women are not able to clean themselves, when water is not available at the time of childbirth, it's absolutely shocking. And so I'm really glad that you've encouraged us to think about water and to really bring it forward, because we talk so much about climate change, but I often feel like it's not understood so much how big a role water plays in that. And I wondered if you had any thoughts.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, when we talk about climate crisis, we tend to forget that we are primarily talking about freshwater scarcity.
Mm,
And especially in the West, it is a bit easy to forget this, particularly in Europe, I would say. Uh, Understandably, of course, sea levels are rising all across the world. But especially across the European continent, we have seen so many flash floods one after another, giving the people maybe the impression that we have an abundance of water. We have too much water around us. But the irony is, amidst this abundance, actually, we're experiencing freshwater scarcity. And for those of us coming from the Middle East, this is not some abstract theoretical question, it is an acute reality. Of the most 10 water stressed nations in the world today, 7 are in the Middle East and in North Africa. So our rivers are dying, as you so powerfully highlighted. And this has definitely consequences for everyone, anyone, but especially for women and children. Women usually are water carriers. They bring water to their communities. When there's no drinkable water nearby, the distance that a young woman has to walk increase, unfortunately increasing the possibility for gender violence. We tend to put these things in different boxes. Here's the box for water scarcity. Here's the box for gender equality. Here's the box for racial discrepancy. But actually, in life, everything is connected. And I think if we want to remember how connected we are, both with each other, but also with nature, we need to look no further than the journey of a drop of water. This is going to become a much more important issue as time goes by. I worry that we might soon see water wars, countries hogging, just keeping water for themselves, building all these dams and not allowing other countries to share the same water. So it is a big, big, big political issue. But primarily what I'm trying to say is we cannot take water for granted. It is still one of the biggest mysteries in our lives. It doesn't behave in the ways we expect it to behave. I was very surprised to find out that there aren't so many scientists who are studying water today. We need more work, but primarily, I think we need interdisciplinary conversations. We need to join the dots. We cannot be single issue people in this age in which everything is connected.
yeah, absolutely. I really agree with that. And I think your book is a very interesting contribution to that, because actually, just reading it, I think any reader will fully appreciate the amount of research that must have gone into that. Not only in terms of the storytelling that you do, you're talking about different times and places and communities and sharing very rich stories, but you also go into detail about water. Some of it feels very scientific at times, and some of it more sort of spiritual or philosophical, but definitely the science is also there. And I was very much in awe, I think, of that. And I think you're right in that we need to have a more intersectional, not just understanding of how we look at the world, and understanding about how different groups and different parts of identities connect, but also understanding that maybe we also need to understand some science and some politics and some human connection and human stories when we're looking at the world. And I think that, yeah, I think that that's really, really important.
This is so important because remember what we talked about earlier at the beginning of this conversation, just becoming more engaged citizens,
Mm.
taking part in these public conversations. I think it's so important that the voices of women be heard there, but also the voices of minorities. I want to hear more working class voices in the public space, more diversity, and then we can construct together a healthier civic space. Now, just like that, I think diversity is important inside a novel too. Of course, every author is different. Some authors like it to write in a much more minimalistic way. I'm not saying there's
Mm.
only one particular way, but the novels that I love are the ones that help me to go beyond my own little corner of the universe. I've always been interested in that. And I think we should read across the board, fiction and nonfiction. Let's read everything and anything that speaks to us in that moment in time. Nothing is highbrow, nothing is lowbrow. I don't believe in that duality. So I love reading cookbooks. I also love reading political philosophy, history, all of that knowledge. I don't know much about neuroscience, but I would love to learn more. So here I am learning. So we become students of different disciplines. And I think writers need to be two things all our lives. We need to be very good readers, avid readers, curious readers, but also good listeners. Just listen to people, what they're saying. Where are the gaps in between their words? Where are the silences? That's also very, very important, in my opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. And silences is something that feature in your work quite a lot, and it's in this book. And you know, when we think about silence, sometimes we think about those that are silenced. So those, either the stories that are completely omitted from history or the retelling of history, but also there's people who just have not been given a voice, people who are sort of hidden away from others, people whose stories have been lost because the oral tradition of storytelling has died down, or it was abruptly ended. But also you write about the silences that we hold and we experience in our own lives, and the intergenerational element of that. A lot of your characters and a lot of your books are struggling with that. And one of the things that will always come to my mind is, in the Island of Missing Trees, we have a teenage character who is really struggling with the silence of her parents, who are not talking about what happened to them in Cyprus. And it builds up so much in her that she's just at school one day and she just screams, and it's like across 3 pages in the book. It's really very, very impactful. And I think about that a lot, about how the ways in which we censor ourselves, or the ways in which we are not able to talk about our trauma. And I say we, but really I'm probably talking about the generations that came before us, the ways in which they were not given the space and given the time for healing, and given the language and the words and the systems that we have now that help us contextualize some of what we're able to say. We're able to label things and to call a thing, and that in itself can help so much. But for generations before us, that wasn't the case.
Mm, mm,
And yeah, and I think that silence, in so many of the ways that I've just mentioned, really feeds through your work. And what is it that you really strive to do when it comes to breaking the silence, or presenting it and explaining what it is?
Yes, I find this conversation so close to my heart, you know. I think when you're a novelist, you're not only interested in stories. Of course, we love stories. Of course, we love language, words. The alphabet itself is magical to me. You just change a few letters and you create infinite possibilities. However, as much as I'm drawn to stories, I'm also drawn to silences. And by that, I mean buried stories,
Mm,
untold stories, or erased stories. You mentioned oral culture. That's so important because sometimes what written culture has conveniently forgotten, oral culture remembers, continues remember. If you speak with the elderly, they have memories that might not necessarily make it into written books. So for me as a writer, it's so important to also be aware of the importance of the depth of oral culture and what has been erased. I come from a country that has a very long and rich history, but that doesn't necessarily translate into strong memory. If anything, I believe it's quite the opposite. Turkey is a society of amnesia, collective amnesia. Our entire relationship with the past is full of ruptures. And once you have that kind of void, it is very easily filled in by a much more ultra nationalistic imperial nostalgia that talks about, oh, we were always a glorious empire. Okay, but the moment you ask what was life like for a peasant woman who had no access to power or authority in the 17th century Ottoman Empire, then there's a big silence, or a concubine in the harem, or maybe an Armenian silversmith, or an Arab peasant, or a Greek sailor. What was life like for them? Again, big silence. So when you just try to imagine actual human beings whose stories are never covered in official history, then you come across those silences. So I think being a writer is a bit like being a linguistic cultural archaeologist. You need to dig deep through those silences in order to find what has been buried and forgotten. If I may add this, you have spoken about how we respond to memory and amnesia in our families. And I
Mm.
find that subject so important. And I think we should talk about not only family stories, but also family silences. In many families, not only immigrant families, but any family that has experienced some kind of complexity, hardship, and sometimes trauma, there are generational differences. And what I've observed is usually the elderly are the ones who have experienced the biggest hardships. Of course, they haven't forgotten the past, but they do not necessarily talk about the past. They don't even know how to talk about the past. It just sits inside their chest, all those unspoken words and memories. The second generation, usually they're not interested in the past, understandably. We also need to understand them because they have to build a new life. They don't have the time or the energy for the past. It has to be a new beginning, forward looking, tabula rasa. But that leaves the third or the fourth generations in these families, the youngest in these families, who are today asking, I think, the most important questions or the biggest questions about identity, ancestral heritage, family silences. So, in every family, I think there's at least one memory keeper. Somebody does the work of memory keeping. And I think writers are the memory keepers of their societies and their times.
Mm. I think that's so interesting because for quite a long time, I assumed that sort of generational differences with how comfortable one is to express their heritage or culture in, like, in Britain, for example, I assumed that was a reflection of the politics and the society of the time. So, for example, I'm in my mid 30s, but I remember being at school. I was very shy about speaking my mother tongue in front of my classmates. I was very shy about bringing in food, homemade Pakistani food from home. And I always thought it not like it's like when I got slightly older, I thought it was because, well, it was a very fractious time in the 90s and the 2000s. There wasn't multiculturalism and sort of tolerance in the way that we see it today. But hearing you speak, I also wonder if it's because the next generation and also me now that I'm older, if it's because we have been trying to break those silences. And I think when you break those silences, the barriers that you have to your own identity, the barriers that you have to your own experiences are also broken down and you're able to embrace it a bit more. And maybe it's not that I was so worried about the external, but it was because internally I faced that struggle and I wasn't able to embrace my food or embrace my language or my clothing in public because I was struggling so much with really embracing it. Whereas like now that I'm able to ask the questions that I couldn't ask when I was 7 years old. I'm able to ask them now, and I'm able to talk to my nieces and nephews about it, and I can see that they have a completely different relationship with it. And I wonder if maybe it's more an inward struggle than it was ever an outward struggle.
Yeah, that is so interesting. And I think so much actually of that outward or external discrimination is
Mm,
being internalized. We internalize it often without being aware
mm,
of doing so. Same with patriarchy. I mean, if we internalize the gaze of patriarchy, for instance, when we look at the mirror, even when we're alone, we judge ourselves through the eyes of patriarchy. I know this is another example, but there are connections, and then we think, well, maybe I'm not good enough, I'm not this enough or that enough. But actually, who's saying that? Where's that voice coming from? It's not our
mm,
voice. It's an external voice that we have internalized. So I think we need to dismantle those voices. The challenge is we're living in a world that doesn't allow us to be plural,
mm,
to contain multitudes, like Walt Whitman so powerfully reminded us. All human beings contain multitudes. Doesn't matter wherever we come from. But we live in a world, unfortunately, today that is so deeply polarized and bitterly politicized, and a world that likes to create boxes and expects us to remain in that box once and for all. Whereas, your connection to Pakistan, obviously your very strong roots in this country, at the same time, you as a citizen of humanity, right? And same for me. So circles within circles, we have multiple belongings like ripples in water, but that's not the metaphor that we're allowed to embrace. In this country, remember, during this Brexit saga, we have been told that if you're a citizen, of the world, you're a citizen of nowhere. Why? I can be a citizen of the world at the same time, a British citizen at the same time, be very attached to Turkey, the Balkans, the Middle East, but also feel European. We are multiple things. Even someone who might have been born and raised in the same village or town contains lots of multitudes through his stories or her family's stories. Every human being is so complex, and I think literature is there to remind us about this pluralism and complexity. And we should not be afraid of that.
yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And we've spoken about some of the experiences, especially around migration,
Mm,
and so much of those experiences are centered around loss and displacement and grief.
mm,
And in your work, and even in this novel, there is that real exploration of grief, of looking for something, of trying to understand, of displacement, and especially Arthur travels across the world to try and sort of put together this poem that he's been desperately working on, and we see it also with other characters in the book. And I know that you yourself have a lot of experience of migration as a child, but obviously later in life also living in exile as you were somewhat forced to leave Turkey. And I wonder how your experiences of that, of the loss and the grief and the heartache, feeds into your work and the writing of your characters.
It's a beautiful question, but one that I find difficult, to be honest, because it has emotional elements for me.
Mm,
All I can say is I do think a lot about issues like, or concepts like home, belonging, non belonging, exile, uh, and roots. Can we have multiple roots? Can we have roots up in the air, not necessarily buried in the soil? So, all of these questions matter a lot to me. I cannot deny that there's a certain, maybe, melancholy to the life of an immigrant or emigre or exile, whatever word we want to use. So that melancholy is there, but there's also a beauty. There's also a sense of perhaps richness in the way you feel connected to people from completely different backgrounds. So there's a loneliness to it, but there's also a, 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 a sorry, a bridge that reconnects you with humanity. And these two things can happen at the same time. That's why I find it quite complex. But for me, at the end of the day, I think home or motherland is always storyland, you know? That is where I feel most at home. That is where I feel multiple. All the different voices inside me can be free and welcome. That is where I feel connected with the rest of humanity. So that's why I think inside literature there is a sanctuary. Inside art there is a welcoming space, and it's so important that we find that space. This is why it really worries me when governments cut off support for the arts or for libraries. You know, whenever there's the slightest financial difficulty or turbulence, the very first thing that will be taken away in terms of support is budget for the arts. This is
Mm.
not a luxury that we're talking about. This is not something that can be discarded. When there's no music, when there's no art, when there's no library in the neighborhood, imagine a child who might be coming from a disadvantaged background. He or she has no bridge that connects her with other possibilities, with other forms of existence. And I think it's so important that we realize how important is the arts. And when you take away these cultural spaces, it also has political consequences.
Yes, and I think it's, worth worth talking about how recently this is exactly what we've seen during genocide and war and conflict. We have seen the targeting of universities, of cultural institutions, but also of artists and writers and journalists, people that are telling stories and that are spreading information. And we've seen this most blatantly in Gaza over the last 18 months. But around the world, historically, we saw it also in Bosnia during the war. We've seen it in parts of Ukraine. Like, it is happening because it is a target on history. It is a very physical way to try and limit what is going to be told going forwards. And it's a way, I guess, to try and discredit maybe some of the storytelling also. But it is something that we should 100% be shocked by and horrified by and speak out against, because it is it's something that should be preserved, not something that should be attacked in any way, shape, or form.
100%. We should speak out about this and understand the consequences, understand how important it is. Libraries are attacked in times of violence and war and destruction, and I think that's very deliberate. As you pointed out, the way artists, because artists are the storytellers, but also the memory keepers of their nation, of their society. So to target an artist actually is to target collective memory, and collective memory means collective identity. All of these
Mm,
things are connected. That's why I think we, as international community, we need to speak up about the way arts and literature, of course, for me, is always included in this debate, are being targeted. But if I may add this, not only in zones of quote unquote crisis, as international media describes, but also in America, this is happening right
mm,
now, maybe in a slightly different way, how book bans and book removals they're escalating. It's quite alarming since the time of McCarthy, when you look at it, or how cultural centers, cultural spaces are being targeted. So I think while we focus, understandably, on regions where the crisis is very acute and the suffering is clearly unbearable, while we do that, we also need to bear in mind that there's a universal theme that's going on. And my point is, there's no such thing as solid lands versus liquid lands.
mm,
Recently, many people thought, oh, the West is fine, the Western world, you don't need to worry about democracy in the West, you don't need to worry about women's rights in the West. All of these things have been achieved in the West. Well, there's no such thing. I think we're all going through liquid times.
Yes, absolutely. And even like here in Britain, I think, maybe there's not censorship in the same way when it comes to literature in the publishing industry at the moment, anyway. God knows what may happen going forwards, but at the moment, it's okay. But just if we think about even everyday rhetoric, some of the ways that language is being policed, that you can't use certain words or you can't use certain words from certain languages, and you should use this word instead of this word, the very policing of language in and of itself is also part of this trying to curate a certain narrative, trying to limit storytelling, trying to limit ownership also of those. Um, and in your latest novel, the novel is also centered around this epic poem
Mhm.
that has actually survived so much that has happened in history. And I wondered if you could speak about this poem because it is so wonderful, so impressive as a poem in and of itself, but so instrumental in your novel also.
Yeah, really, really appreciate. So we're talking about the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is the oldest piece of literature known in human history. And I think not many people today know about it. Today, when we talk about the Middle East, understandably, we have to talk about conflict and everything that is occurring. At the same time, though, we need to bear in mind that this is such a complex region that was
Mhm.
home to some of the mightiest and wealthiest empires throughout history. People also forget that this was a land that was full of fascinating engineering, fascinating irrigation canals, an amazing abundance of richness, and at the same time, libraries like the Library of Ashurbanipal. So I also find it important to be aware of the diversity and depth and richness of the region. And when we trace it, when we go back in time, one of the many, many, many stories that could be found in the library of Ashurbanipal, King Ashurbanipal, who was a very mighty, very learned, very intellectual king in the Assyrian Empire, but that didn't necessarily mean he was a nice person.
Oh,
He
yes.
was no less cruel than his predecessors. And like many emperors, he thought that his empire was going to be forever. And when Nineveh is destroyed, the library is also attacked by their enemies. But the interesting thing about a library full of clay tablets is it's very different than a library full of paper. So, paper, if you burn it down, unfortunately, it's gone. Papyrus is gone. But a library full of clay tablets will only be hardened. Those tablets will only be hardened if they're burnt down. And this is what happens precisely. So they survive. That literature survives, albeit under the ground in a broken form, shattered form. And among those stories is the Epic of Gilgamesh, which was transmitted orally for centuries and centuries before it was written down by scribes, which means it is actually much, much older than we know.
Mm.
This is also a very relevant story for our times. I think we should all be reading the Epic of Gilgamesh, which inspired lots of Greek myths, lots of stories across the world. It was written much, much earlier. This is a story about friendship, about journeys, about going into other people's lands and taking their things, right?
Mm.
It's a story about our fear of death, our desire to make sense of our mortality, our desire to prolong our youth. But the
Mm.
interesting thing is, at the beginning of the epic, we don't have a typical hero because when you look at Gilgamesh himself, he's a terrible, terrible creature. You wouldn't like him, he does terrible things. And it's only through journeys and defeat and failure that he returns to where he started, having achieved nothing, having failed in everything, and yet he's a kinder and wiser person. So, in that regard, it's quite an unusual structure for a myth to have. But if I may quickly add this, for me as a storyteller, what is interesting is ever since the Epic of Gilgamesh was told or written down, imagine so many emperors have come and gone, empires have perished, yeah? Even the biggest monuments have crumbled to dust. But a poem made of words and made of breath, has survived the tides of history. And here we are, you and I, thousands of years later, we're still talking about that poem. So I think it shows us and it reminds us that literature has a very gentle, quiet, but a very, very profound strength and wisdom and resilience. And that should give us hope.
Yeah, that's so beautiful and so powerful, and yeah, it that does fill me with hope just listening to you speak, and just the visual of something written into clay and that surviving so much time, but fires and disasters and all kinds of things, and it's still staying strong, and it not being changed by man or by the world, I think is really, really quite phenomenal. And in the book you talk about how, you know, part of the poem is ends up in the British Museum, and that's where our character of Arthur, he finds it. And Arthur is a really extraordinary character because he is born in the slums of London on the banks of the River Thames, completely unsuspecting as characters go. And he ends up turning out to be just with the most incredible mind and the sort of determination and the ability to understand and to translate and to sort of decode and to, to really, really understand this work that's been written in a ancient and foreign language, not even in English. um but the whole thing with Arthur and with the tablets being in the British Museum raises so many questions about ancient artifacts, about ownership, about things that have been taken from places around the world that are being kept in places like the British Museum, whether that can be justified in the sort of in the name of preservation, or whether it should be given back to communities as ownership and their rightful ownership. And I just wondered, what were you really interested in exploring about that? What did you want us to think about?
Indeed, I find this question so important. Who owns the past? Who
Mm,
gets to tell the story of the past? I think museums need to engage within this conversation. They can't say, it has nothing to do with us. And I would rather actually they lead the way. These are timely questions, and also they're quite complex. If we want to understand the complexity, actually, literature is a good space to open up these discussions, because inside a novel in particular, you can hold nuanced arguments. You can be, at least person speaking for me, I can be interested in someone like George Smith, who inspired my character in the book. I call him King Arthur of the Sewers and the Slums. That's my fictional character is called. There's a reason why he's given this unusual name.
mm,
As you pointed out, he is loosely based on an actual historical figure, a Victorian era genius, in my opinion, a man who was given no support whatsoever. He is born into severe poverty. At the time, in the slum tenements of Chelsea, just pulled out of school as a young boy. Imagine, had he been alive today, probably we would have recognized the beauty of his brain, the neurodivergence of his mind. We would have recognized the neurodivergence of his mind, and we would have respected that. But at the time, of course, he gets no recognition or support. And purely by coincidence, he comes to the British Museum. He sees these broken, shattered clay tablets brought over from the Middle East. And little by little, he starts piecing them together. Even though at the time almost no one can read the cuneiform, the script. So I think it's also interesting that in order to find the missing lines in the Epic of Gilgamesh, because he decodes the flat tablet, um, which creates a huge discussion at the time, because
mm,
what he finds is a very similar story to the story of Noah's Ark in the Old Testament, in the holy books, except this story is much much older. So people get divided. Some people say, well, you see, it shows us that the holy books are right. It really happened in history. Whereas more scientific minded people at the time, they say, it also shows us that as humanity, we've been telling ourselves the same old stories again and again. So this very timid, introverted, shy scholar, he finds himself in the middle of a very heated debate, which to me was very interesting. And in order to find the 17 missing lines in the epic of in the flood tablet, he comes to the Middle East, he loses his life there, and today he's buried in a forgotten graveyard between Turkey and Syria. And a part of me wanted to um, understand this kind of passion, you know. But my point is, while we might appreciate the dedication and the passion of one scholar of such an interesting archaeologist, at the same time we can be quite critical of colonial institutional history. Inside a novel, you can do multiple things, unlike social media, in which everything is reduced to angry sound bites and absolute clashing certainties. You know, let's talk about the artifacts brought over from the Middle East, which is an important story not only for the British Museum but also for the Louvre or the Metropolitan. And then we need to talk about private ownership. There were families, wealthy families at the time in England, who just owned artifacts from Nineveh, you know. And can we please talk about that? Some of these artifacts, on the way here, they were lost, damaged. At the bottom of the river Tigris, there are Lamastu sculptures,
Mm.
tablets, because they sunk while they were being carried. So it's not a smooth transition either. However, as we're speaking about this colonial past, I think we need to ask ourselves, what were the Ottoman Empire or what were the Ottoman authorities doing? Now, the question we in Turkey never ever talk about. Yeah, that's another layer. And then we have to talk about the destruction of cultural heritage by ISIS extremists, which is exactly what they did in Syria and in Iraq. Not only they destroyed museums, but a less well-known subject is they also made a lot of profit from illegal, illicit trafficking of cultural artifacts. Such an extent that at one point on Portobello Road, you could find artifacts from Baghdad, from Soleimani, from Damascus. Imagine. So this is a very layered, multi-layered issue, and I think inside a novel we can create a calmer, wiser, nuanced conversation, and then you leave the answers to the reader. But I think it's the writer's job to care about these questions.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're so right in that it's very easy to step foot in the British Museum and have a very binary black and white view of what's happened. And your automatic thinking is this was stolen by the British colonial authorities from India or from Iraq or from wherever it's been stolen from, taken from, and that's it, and it should go back. They shouldn't be having it. But actually, what you said is that there's a whole another so many more layers of actually what may have happened, and that still may not change the fact that it still maybe shouldn't be in the British Museum and it still should be with the community, but just opening our minds up to that different in that the difference in understanding. And I also liked what you said about holding space for admiration for the work of somebody like the character of King King Arthur, for example, but also to still hold space for that critical thing. And I think about that a lot when it comes to my own identity. You know, I am British. I was born and bred in London. I spent 25 years living in London before I moved around. And I love the UK in so many ways, but I'm also so critical of its past. I'm so critical of its politics, and the two can exist at the same time. And I think to really allow yourself to have space for the two things instead of trying to push yourself, as you've described it before, into one box or another. You know, and I think that is really, really important in how you engage with the world and how you also accept yourself and give grace to yourself in you with your own identity. Otherwise, you're constantly denying yourself
Mhm.
the ability to live live happily, essentially.
Yeah, yeah, 100%. I mean, your words are so important. Sometimes in Turkey, people say, "Oh, if you criticize, it means you don't love your country."
Mm,
Not at all, you know?
mm,
It's the opposite. To have critical thinking means, I've put thought into this. I'm also open to learning. It's not like absolute certainty, but it shows that you care, that I care, so caring and critical thinking, they go hand in hand. Also, to be aware of those nuances is a healthy thing. We can be critical of a government. That doesn't mean rejecting an entire culture. They're not the same thing. So I think nuanced conversations are so important. And this is precisely what we're being denied in the age of social media. There's a reason why, wherever we look across the world, let's focus on how populist demagogues talk. There's a reason why they love to simplify things, they love to promise simplicity, and they love division and tension. We can be, we can have our critical opinions on almost everything, but at the same time be open to a dialogue with people who think differently. Most people are on a spectrum. It's not like mutually exclusive categories. And for me, that's very important because there has to be a shared ground for values. When we lose that shared ground, when societies become badly broken, badly polarized, the only people who benefit from that are the demagogues themselves. So I think bridge building in this age is so, so important.
yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And one of the other main characters in your book is Narian,
Yeah.
which, is a member of the Yazidi community,
Mm,
living by the banks of the Tigris River.
mm,
And I was really fascinated actually reading that part of the book because there was so much I didn't know about this community, about their history and about what they believe and how they behave, and also the importance, I think, of oral traditions within within the Yazidi community. But actually, what also you're very interested in doing is to talk about the Yazidi genocide, particularly of 2014, which was um, perpetrated by ISIS. And I wondered if you could just take a moment to talk about why this was so important for you to feature in this book.
yes, the Yazidis, as you know, are one of the most vulnerable minorities in the region.
Mm,
They have been maligned and persecuted and misunderstood primarily for centuries and centuries. So, on the one hand, this is unfortunately not a new story. The Yazidi lore talks about 72 massacres. They refer date by date. And the 73rd happened in 2014 when ISIS extremists launched a genocide. What perhaps not many people realize at the time or ever since is that the very first thing that the extremists did was to kill the water. They poisoned the water first, so they poisoned the wells and the fountains, leaving no water to drink for entire communities. And then they attacked the villages. They killed the elderly first. Again, very deliberate, because when you kill the elderly in a community like the Yazidis, where identity is transmitted via oral storytelling,
mm,
ballads, folk tales, lullabies, it is not written down. Most of it is oral culture, what holds the community together. So if you kill the elderly, you kill collective memory. And if you kill collective memory, you kill collective identity. And they killed the man, and they kidnapped the women and children. As we're speaking right now, there are more than 3,000 Yazidi women still missing, and across the region, in ordinary neighborhoods. Purely by coincidence, one of these young women was saved from a house in Ankara, in the
mm,
neighborhood where I grew up, my maternal
mm,
grandmother's house, literally a few streets away.
mm,
Writing this book at the time, I saw this, I read, I did research, and it really struck me hard because how is it possible that a human being is kept under such horrific circumstances in an ordinary neighborhood, middle class neighborhood in Ankara, and the people around don't know? don't see it. We're talking about a very close-knit community here. So it also made me think about numbness. When do we stop caring about what's happening next door? In that sense, I am hoping that literature is the antidote to numbness.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. And I really, really hope so too. And just, I know that we are running very rapidly out of time, but I honestly, I feel like I could speak to you all day. Um, you spoke earlier as well about sort of this disappointment and misunderstanding that comes about when people think that we're criticizing our nation, or whether it's the place that we're living or our home countries, our motherlands, whatever it is, that sort of refusal to really try to engage with what we are saying and holding space for love and criticism at the same time. And I know that this is something you have immense experience of, because you were essentially accused of anti-Turkishness in your work, and then later on for a level of, I don't know what word they use, but it being inappropriate in some way or another.
Yeah.
And that, as a fiction writer, your fiction was kind of taken to trial, and you described this very surreal experience where your Turkish lawyers were having to defend your characters, and it felt as though your characters were on stage, less so you, although you were massively impacted by everything going on and all the sort of hatred and death threats that came your way, which ultimately led you to have to leave Turkey. And I wondered how this entire experience has shaped you as a person, shaped you as a writer, and shaped your determination to continue to tell stories that could be perceived in that very polarizing way.
Yeah, yes. Well, it's quite surreal, isn't it? As
Mm,
a novelist, you don't expect to find yourself in such situations.
mm,
Um, but when there's no proper freedom of speech, when there's no functioning democracy, these things do happen. Nonetheless, it feels absurd almost. It feels surreal almost, which doesn't mean that it doesn't affect us. It did affect me. In 2006, I was put on trial for writing a novel called The Bastard of Istanbul, which talks about a Turkish family and an Armenian American family, mostly through the eyes of women, grandmothers, mothers, granddaughters. And it does talk about memory and amnesia, and it does talk about the Armenian genocide, which is a big, big taboo still to this day in Turkey. But the way I wrote it, at least personally, the way I see it, it's a very constructive book that tries to also find not only what we've forgotten, but what we can create together. You know, how we can connect. So I see it as a bridge building novel, in fact. And however, we have an article in the Turkish constitution which protects Turkishness against insults, even though nobody knows what that means. And this had been used against historians, scholars, but never ever before against a fiction writer. I
mm,
found myself in a very Kafkaesque situation, really, in which the words of fictional characters were brought to court as evidence, which resulted in my Turkish lawyer defending my fictional characters. And during that time, there were people burning EU flags on the streets, spitting at my pictures. Eventually, I was acquitted, and the fictional characters were acquitted. But years later, again, I was investigated, prosecuted, this time two of my novels. And this time the accusation was quote unquote crime of obscenity, because I write about issues like gender violence, but also child brides, which essentially for me, in my eyes, means child abuse. These are the realities of the world, of the region where I come from, or the country where I come from. So instead of doing something about it, instead of changing the laws, instead of opening shelters for victims of abuse, the fact that authorities can go after fiction writers is to me just so ironic, so paradoxical. But I also hear your question in the sense that how do we keep writing, right? How do we keep creating? Under such circumstances. And I think the only way to do that is we need to go back to our fiction, back to that zone. When I'm writing a novel, I try to stay in that zone for as long as I can, as deep as I can. You know, if I were to start thinking, oh, what are people going to think when they read? Are they going to get upset? Are the authorities going to get upset? Then I cannot write. So my point is that fictional world becomes my reality. Those fictional characters become my companions. And when the novel is done, when I give it to my editor, then I can have panic attacks and anxiety attacks. But by then, the book is born and it's
Yeah.
a life of its own. And I think we need that autonomy. We need that
Mm.
freedom in order to be able to create art.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And it's funny because you spoke about how this like very surreal experience of having your lawyer defending your characters, and it made me smile because I mean I do this all the time in conversations about books and book clubs with friends. I will defend the character that I think that this character made the right decision and somebody will disagree with me. But that's because we're existing within the fictional world and we're talking in the realms of the fictional world. It's very bizarre to take that outside into into the real world and no less into a courtroom, of all places. And just to end, Elif, because it has been so wonderful speaking to you. There Are Rivers in the Sky has been out since September of last year, but is now coming out in paperback in April. Very exciting. What do you hope that readers will take away from this book?
Oh, beautiful question. Um, I really, really respect the fact that every reader will come up with their own conclusions. Uh, I love that kind of diversity. I think a writer's job is never, ever to preach or to try to teach or lecture. I don't know the answers myself. I'm learning. We're all on a journey. We're learning. But the only thing I know is I care about the questions. I care about all the subjects that we have covered in this podcast. They're so close to my heart. And it's that caring, it's that curiosity that was my guide. But I will always leave the answers to the readers. I've known couples who have been married for 45 years. They read the same book, but they don't read it in the same way. One of them loves it, maybe the other
Mm,
one not so much.
mm,
Or I have met friends who share everything, every little secret. They read the same book, but they feel connected to completely different characters for very different reasons. Why? Because the reader is not passive. Every reader's reading is unique, like our fingerprints.
mm.
Reader brings their own gaze into the story, and that's how actually books are born. So I would refrain from drawing a conclusion, but if I may just say this, we should pay attention to the world around us. We should care about each other, and even a tiny little drop of water, we should not take it for granted.
Absolutely. Well, Elif, thank you so much for your time. It's been such a pleasure speaking to you on the show today.
Such a pleasure for me. I'm so grateful. Thank you for your words and thank you for your time.
I hope you loved listening to this episode and found things that will stay with you. I'd love to hear from you, so please do reach out on social media and don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a review as it can really help.